So, progressive rock has its classics, but not every album soared. Today I've got 20 prog rock albums that crashed, burned, or just didn't land. From ambitious flops to misguided experiments, this is prog gone wrong. Prog rock is famous for complexity, virtuosity, and epic concepts, but sometimes that ambition backfires. Bands chasing trends, abandoning their sound, or just overreaching created albums that critics and fans often call disasters, myself included. Now, I'm looking at albums where ideas didn't translate into quality, where experimentation just simply went too far, or where the music simply, fell flat. In other words, horror stories. Whilst it's fair to say that these were not from the golden age of prog, that doesn't apply to all of them. A Gentle Giant opened the proceedings this time with an offering that all but stripped down their singing to complex arrangements for a more radio-friendly approach in their 1980 album Civilian. Now, it was readily noticeable that the album felt more disjointed than previous efforts and lacked the band's true trademark ingenuity. The songs were much more simpler in nature, often generic, losing that intricate interplay that fans just loved, myself included. The production was considered flat, making even any skilled performances really sound uninspired. And many fans viewed this as a sellout move, compromising artistic integrity for reward. Vocals felt quite uneven, and the harmonies underwhelming. Compared to earlier works like Octopus or Freehand, this was a major step down. Overall, Civilian is often cited as Gentle Giant's true misfire. Now, even some of the greats have been known to sink into the abyss. And my second example is none other than Mike Oldfield, with his shift to mainstream pop with his Earth Moving album from 1989, which surprised many of his longtime fans. Now, it's been described as overproduced and devoid of the instrumental brilliance of other albums from his discography, and I think that's a fair criticism. The songs relied heavily on session vocalists, diluting that natural signature style of his. Synth and drum machines dominated, giving the album that dated 1980s sheen. The melodic hooks were forgettable, lacking Oldfield's usual emotional depth. Reviews called it a commercial compromise that failed to please either pop or prog audiences. Fair assessment. Even long-time supporters found the album bland and uninspired, and it remains one of the least celebrated entries in his discography. Jason Anderson of AllMusic said that not just casual fans, but even Oldfield loyalists will have trouble with Earth Moving, one of the artist's lesser albums. And he rated it just 2 stars. Free as a Bird marks Supertramp's attempt to update their sound for the 80s. Of this 1987 album, it's lethargic with uninspired melodies and a dated synth production to it. The band's clever lyricism felt absent. It was replaced by generic pop rock cliches. Vocals were inconsistent, lacking that distinctive clarity from earlier albums. Songs dragged without the usual dynamic shifts. Supertramp fans expected. Even the band admitted it wasn't one of their proudest works, but Davies himself called it an experiment to try and be modern. Many saw it as just downright disappointing. And when you consider their earlier classic releases, it's frequently cited as a low point in their career. German prog band Triumvirate abandoned much of their own progressive complexity on Russian Roulette, which was released in 1980. AllMusic said of this one that really nothing is left of the old Triumvirate that we knew and loved at this point. They're very poppy and not terribly interesting. Oh dear. The songwriting was inconsistent. You got jarring shifts between the styles, punctuated with these synth-heavy arrangements, often overshadowing the band's best musicianship. Vocals were bland compared to early releases. Overall, another album that just lacked cohesion, making it feel like a collection of ideas rather than a unified record. Russian Roulette stands as a cautionary tale of prog bands chasing trends. Now, even the usually exquisite Renaissance managed an entry on this list, and their 1981 offering Camera leaned heavily into those 1980s pop production techniques. And they lost the lush symphonic style of their previous albums. The arrangements felt really quite awkward. And the songwriting had to be said, it was weaker than before. Aslam's vocals really remained strong, as they would do, but they were often buried under synth-heavy mixes. Tracks were formulaic and lacked any real emotion or resonance. The instrumental interplay, once a hallmark, was minimal, and it left fans totally disappointed by the stylistic shift. The album failed to chart significantly, marking it as a commercial as well as artistic setback. I'm really very disappointed to include one from this band, one of my favourites, but it seems even the very, very best had their off days. Now, 1987 was a significant moment for Pink Floyd as their album A Momentary Lapse of Reason was released, and this was the first one without Roger Waters, so expectations were really set very high. But what we got was something that really lacked conceptual depth, feeling more like session work than a cohesive album. David Gilmour's guitar work was solid. You would expect no less, but the songwriting really didn't match. Production relied heavily on synths and digital effects, and that really dates the sound. Some tracks were criticised for overlong, meandering sections, not the first time this has been said. And even fans of the post-Waters era admitted it really didn't capture the magic of earlier classics. The album was commercially successful, but artistically divisive. It's often remembered as a competent, but yet uninspired, Floyd release. Then we have the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. And this award went to that usually brilliant Dutch band Focus. And guess what? They had a collaboration with American vocalist PJ Proby in 1978, which was really widely panned. It's a classic mismatch in styles between Proby's pop soul voice and the band's intricate prog sound. What were they thinking here? The instrumentation felt cluttered and restrained to accommodate PJ's vocals. Arrangements lacked the precision of earlier albums. Songs, they were all over the show, mixing ambitious ideas, but with poorly executed pop attempts. The production was criticised for sounding amateurish. That really hurt. Fans just largely rejected it, seeing it as a misstep. Focus con Proby as one quite rightly labelled as the band's weakest efforts. Now, Eloy in 1992 released the album Destination, honestly described as sterile and lacking the atmospheric grandeur of their 1970s work. Both the guitar and keyboards were repetitive and uninspiring, and the songs melodically weak and structurally simplistic. Now, the lyrics appear to be quite generic, losing Eloy's poetic touch that they were renowned for. Fans seemed to notice that the band had become disconnected from the progressive roots. Why? We just simply don't know. The production emphasised more electronic textures at the expense of their organic sound, and it remains a largely forgotten, underwhelming release in their catalogue. Now, I have immense respect for Steve Howard, let me say that before we go any further, and rate him extremely highly, just behind Steve Hackett as my favourite guitarist. But it was with his third solo album, Turbulence from 1991, that really attracted comments for the wrong reasons. Whilst musically his standard remained so very high, this album simply lacked focus, jumping between styles, really without much cohesion. The compositions just didn't feel strong enough, with tracks feeling like perhaps exercise pieces rather than songs, sadly. Production relied heavily on the 80s digital effects, and vocals described as inconsistent and largely forgettable. Reviewers called it uneven and uninspiring. Fans of Yes' progressive depth found it shallow. Turbulence was seen as a technically competent but an artistically weak release. But with the 1980 release of Conquest, this attempted to modernise Uriah Heep's sound, but it stumbled very badly. Some poor songwriting and flat production were blamed as reasons for the lack of success on this album. The vocals sounded literally all over the place, with David Byron's style inconsistent with the material this time around. Instrumentation became overblown without really delivering any emotional impact. The material, it just lacked anything really memorable, giving the impression that it was forced. It was considered a big step down from albums like Demons and Wizards. Reception was perhaps lukewarm at best. The album became frequently highlighted as a misstep in Uriah Heep's majestic career. Stereotomy was released in 1985 by the Alan Parsons Project, but was quickly criticised for over-reliance on synthesizers and 1980s production trends. The concept also felt forced and unclear, lacking the cohesion of earlier works. Melodies were weak and repetitive. Vocals, although competent, really lacked any passion. Instrumental passages were considered uninspired. Fans found it difficult to engage with the album's themes. Commercially, it also underperformed compared to previous releases, and it remains one of the least celebrated Alan Parsons Project albums. The less said, the better, I think, on this one. Now, Ring of Changes from Barclay James Harvest was another to suffer in 1983. What did go on in these 80s? It was described as bland and lacking any emotional punch of the earlier works. Again, synth-heavy arrangements overshadowed the band's organic sound. Vocals felt uninspired and melodies were forgettable. Instrumental interplay was minimal. Fans of the band have been known to skip this record entirely, and I don't blame them. It failed to make a significant commercial impact. It is really widely viewed as a low point in their discography. There's been a few of these, hasn't there? Oh, look who's up again, Gentle Giant. Their 1978 offering, Giant for a Day. This is where they abandoned complex arrangements again in favour of pop rock. It felt simplistic and unambitious compared to their earlier catalogue. The vocals were not inspiring or underwhelming harmonies. Need I go on? And that usual instrumental sophistication was sacrificed simply for accessibilities. Songs potentially dragged on or felt underdeveloped. The production was generic, failing really to capture the band's usual energy. It's considered really a failure. And it's sad for them that they've got a second entry on this list. Test for Echo from 1996 received some mixed reviews for the band Rush, with some praising the musicianship, but many noting quite lacklustre songwriting. What a surprise! It was suggested that the album lacked any real memorable hooks and energy, with Geddy Lee's vocals really quite all over the show on several tracks. Strangely, the lyrics were criticised as less than inspired than previous conceptual works, which was very unusual for master wordsmith Neil Peart. The production emphasised polish over raw creativity. Instrumental passages were competent but really failed to excite. It was considered competent but ultimately forgettable, and it's often ranked among Rush's weaker releases. Now, in 1983, the Enid offered Something Wicked This Way Comes, and this struggled with production and overambitious arrangements. The music was deemed as overly bombastic without strong songwriting. Synths dominated, drowning subtle instrumentation. Vocal performances were inconsistent. Tracks felt disjointed, lacking a cohesive flow. It was really very difficult to connect to this album emotionally, and the concept really failed to resonate. It's remembered as a misstep in the Enid's often excellent catalogue. Rock and Roll Prophet by Rick Wakeman from 1982 was widely panned for weak songwriting and forced humour. Described as gimmicky and lacking Wakeman's usual virtuosity, the instrumentation was uninspired and flat. Vocals were amateurish and tracks felt rushed and really quite underdeveloped. Fans were bewildered by the stylistic shift. The production felt dated and cheap-sounding, and it remains one of Wakeman's most notorious failures. Bandmate John Anderson's solo album In the City of Angels from 1988 tried to capture 80s pop trends. What it did do was dilute his ethereal voice with overproduced tracks. Songwriting was considered weak and repetitive, very unusual for Anderson. Lyrics lacked his unusual imaginative flair. There were synths and drum machines, and dated the sound quite badly. Fans of Yes often rejected it outright. Melodies felt forgettable and unevenly paced, and it does remain one of Anderson's most criticised solo efforts. The album The Wedge, released in 1986, saw Pallas attempting a slick 80s production style, but the songwriting lacked any sort of depth and originality. Songs were formulaic and predictable. Instrumentation overshadowed by production effects. Vocals were inconsistent, sometimes really quite flat. Fans of some of the earlier, more raw albums were very much disappointed. The album failed to capture attention commercially, and it's considered one of the band's weakest works. Magenta's The 27 Club was released in 2013, quite late on for this list, and attempted a concept-driven approach, but struggled with cohesion. The songwriting was uneven and had derivative passages. Instrumental sections often lacked any kind of innovation. Vocals were competent, but really quite unmemorable. Production quite polished, but really didn't elevate the material. Fans found the narrative forced and hard to follow. Songs occasionally dragged without real purpose. And the album remains a divisive release in Magenta's catalogue. I end with Five Bridges by The Nice from 1970. This was a super ambitious but uneven in execution. There's awkward transitions between the orchestral and rock sections. Some performers were sloppy or overindulgent. Songs lacked some cohesion and focus. Production made some of the parts feel quite muddled. Fans saw inconsistency compared to their debut work, and the album's concept overshadowed musical quality. It's often remembered really as a flawed experiment rather than a true classic. So that wraps up our look at 20 prog rock albums that missed the mark. Now look, these are some observations on the albums that I have known over a large number of years, and it's not meant to be a hatchet job on them. They come from bands I truly love, but looking back may not have been their greatest moments of achievement. Some fail because of overambition, others because of trend chasing, and a few just simply couldn't match their previous highs. The question for you is, do you agree with these choices, or are there other disasters I've missed? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let me know what to tackle in the next video. And on screen now is the first set of horror albums I looked at, and I want you to watch that next. So until next time, keep listening, keep exploring, and remember, in the world of prog, the journey really never ends.